Hello everyone, I'm Paul Johnston. I am, as I've put on here, I am a startup veteran. I think that probably means that I've done more than two. So it's a very, very simple thing. I'm just going to talk, this is going to be 20 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. It might not be very long, it doesn't have to be very long. But it's just a few of my thoughts about how, how startups and Christianity, and primarily tech startups, kind of where they collide and where they're good and bad. So a little bit about me. I am on Twitter. That's the first thing you need to know, and that is my username, Paul D. Johnston. I'm also on Medium, and I blog a lot on tech stuff. Find me there. I've also been a web techie since 1998. So some of you possibly, no, most of you were born by then, that's fine. I'm now working with people and beginning to talk to people who weren't born when I started out with the internet, which is worrying me because it makes me feel very old. Since about 2000, I've been working with various different types of startups. So 2000 was before the original bubble burst. There was a lot of money and it was quite a lot of fun, but no one actually knew what they were doing. I've had various different roles. Started off being a web dev, started off doing even a little bit of design, and I'm very bad at that. But I was playing around with Linux, Red Hat 4.1, things that most people have never even thought existed. And from about 2008, I was working as a consultant, and a consultant mainly to startups. And startups is a kind of funny, I'll get you to, there's some interaction in this, so don't all fall asleep. It'll get there. Can you all see, or do you want me to stand over there a bit and wander backwards and forwards? Are you all right? I'm just kind of, I'm recognising I need to stand further back. So I work with startups, and those startups tended to be someone who's about 22, just left university with a big idea and thinks they're going to be a billionaire. Their middle name is Zuckerberg, that kind of thing. They're quite hard to work with. If you've ever come across an entrepreneur who thinks they know everything, that's what they're all like. And what I found was that working with all of these people is that they have great ideas, but they often don't understand how businesses work and how life works and how, family works, and you have other things in your world other than the tech. And that's because they are 22 and they've not got anything else in their life apart from the tech. I'm also now, and have been for about 18 months, the CTO of a company called Movivo. Now, Movivo is it's a commercial organization that works primarily in emerging and developing economies to help people to earn free internet. That's the pitch. It's an Android app. It's not that complicated, but it's got a lot of serverless technology in the back end. Who's heard the phrase serverless technology? Mainly from me. Who's heard it from someone other than me? Good, there's a few people. That's all right, phew. So I started using it about 18 months ago, and I started this job just for fun. It turned into the back end of our production system, and now I go to America to talk about it. But that's because we started 18 months before anyone else came along. I am also married, and I have 5 children. So don't clap me for that. That's not something to clap me for. Saw someone just beginning to think about it. And all I say that for is that I have a life outside of my work. My work is not everything. And I think that's quite an important point. So just to kind of give you a bit of an idea of, out of interest, who's seen this before, this definition of a startup? Who's seen it? 2 people. I'll read it out then. A startup is a temporary organisation used to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. It's not your guy starting up a web design agency in the corner. It's not your guy, your girl starting up a plumbing business. I'm going to not walk this way because that's a bad idea. I'm going to stay over here. Sorry, everyone over here. You can't see the screen. It's not your plumbing business. It is an attempt to create something at scale. It's an attempt to do something different. It's an attempt to. It doesn't have to be a new model. It doesn't have to be a new thing, but it has to be. It has to be able to. It has to be doing something at scale. And that means it's got to be worth something at some point in the not too distant future. So
that's fine, don't worry about it.
that's not something I need to worry about, apparently. Can you all hear me all right? Is this coming out quite loud? Is that okay? Just good, fine. So some aspects of a startup that I think are worth saying, and I've been in enough to know that these are all kind of true. They're inherently risky, as in massively risky. They are more than you might imagine. The payout is often very high, but it's also very unlikely. Out of interest, what percentage do you think of all tech startups, which is the area I know, get seed funding? Bear in mind, seed funding is the lowest level of funding. What percentage do you think? Come on, shout out some numbers. 10? Anyone else want to shout? Any? No? No? It's between 1 and 2. That's seed funding. That's just the first bit of seed funding. That's just the initial bit. That's how risky it is. It's so risky. It's more risky than anything else you'll ever do, pretty much, because if you think you're going to become a billionaire, you're living in cloud cuckoo land, pretty much. Out of interest, anyone want to make the next Uber? Anyone? I wouldn't. They lose $3 billion a year. Why would you want to start that company? So usually with a startup, they're also a small team with a big idea, and often they are young and they don't have families. Just seems to be the kind of people that get attracted to them. They often need funding. Now, funding can come in various different ways. The ones that we hear about are things like venture capital, but there's also seed funding, angel funding, and various different sorts of funding. But you actually just need to understand a lot to do with money, and it's all about money. And they're also very time-consuming. Startups, how many people work in what you would describe as a startup, roughly? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6. And how many of you do more than 40 hours a week? Yeah, not all of you, most of you, but or roughly that. It's not unusual to get people working in startups who are working, 9 till 9, 6 days a week, and then the other day they're still doing stuff. I think startups are also incredibly mentally challenging. They're very There's a number of different things about this, and it's only just becoming recognised within the industry, actually, that mental health is a really big deal. And within a startup environment, actually, because of the risk, and because of the payout, and because of the attitudes of the founders, and all of those other things, you actually end up with quite a toxic mix of not really understanding how people work. And especially when you've got a family, it can be really difficult. So I have worked in a startup where I've said, no, I'm going home at 5:30 in the evening, and I've been shouted at for doing so. And then I go, and then the next day I come back in and they fire me. And I'm like, well, fine, that's absolutely okay. This isn't a reasonable thing for you to ask me to do, and I was leaving, and I was going home, and I wanted to be with my family. And that happens usually in a scenario where people don't understand that life outside is quite an important thing. Who likes the phrase unicorn? I do, it's brilliant. They don't exist. Just wanted to point that one out. Everyone wants to try and create something that doesn't exist. It's why I quite like the idea of it. But the payout can be enormous. How many people here know someone that has started a startup and then had it sold for more than $1 million? A few. A very few. And that, I think, is the point, is that $1 million isn't very much in actual fact within the startup world. And there's only 3 people in the room. These things are inherently risky. So I just thought I'd bring in the Bible. This is a kind of Christian thing, after all. I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the worldview on work. Now, Genesis, God gave the world to Adam, and he basically expected him to work on it and keep it in order. And, work is a good thing. We're not here to bash the idea of working hard. We should work hard. But I think it kind of goes hand in hand with integrity as well, with the fact that we should spend our time doing work. We should spend our time in these environments. And if we work in a startup, we should work as hard as we can. But I think you work as hard as you can, but you set limits. And I think that's quite important. And as long as you set the right limits, don't be silly about it, you can end up with a good relationship. Now, this is my thinking rather than anything else. So this isn't, I'm not really pulling this from anywhere other than what I see on in the way that we are taught to view work within the church. And this is my experience, a lot of it, so don't take this as, you know, the truth and what everyone else says. But I think Christians are very risk averse. I think we're actually, as a group, very poor at understanding risk. I think we're very good at understanding that gambling is wrong, but then we're not very good at going, well, that's a gamble, but that's a good risk to take. And I think we miss both of those things. I think we often, as a community, value someone who can preach much more highly than someone who can lead a business. I think if you wanted to talk about superstars within the Christian world, your first person wouldn't be someone from HTB. They would be, unless it was one of the preachers from HTB, it wouldn't be a businessman. But actually, God puts business at the heart of some people's calling and some people's lives. And I think we demean and diminish people's calling in that context. I think when you talk about the Sabbath, I think some people actually have jobs. My dad was one of them. He was a doctor. Some people have jobs where Sundays are not very easy to do. And so basically you lose out on the ability to have community, and you end up not being what's seen as not being a full part of the congregation. And it ends up being, you know, if you're not here on a Sunday, well, you're not being a very good Christian, which is complete rubbish. You can, you know, it's quite important to be able to identify that different people should be doing different things. But also within the startup world, when you think about it, you can be working 24/7 for a period of time to launch something that could be amazing. It's not anti-Christian to work hard. It's understanding the meaning behind a Sabbath can be much more important than being religious about it. I think, out of interest, when we talk about money, what's the first thing you think about when you talk about money in Christianity? Anyone? Giving. And anyone else? Does anyone think of the word tithe? Hands up. Good. At least people are being honest. How many people think 10% when I say the word tithe? A bunch of people think that. And so as soon as you start going, startup world, you know, what are you doing with all of your money? Are you giving? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? Money is quite toxic within the church, actually, as a conversation. It's one of the things I sit there and despair about. Mainly because when you're doing a startup, you can't guarantee a salary. Certainly initially you can't guarantee a salary. And so you can't guarantee that you're going to be able to pay a tithe. You can't guarantee all of these things. And I think we need to think about that. And I think also when you look at startups, I think family is more important within the church than anything. But also separating out the idea of doing a good job and spending less time with family is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's also, if it's constantly you're just taking away from your family, that is a bad thing. But sometimes there are times when you need to do both. So as I think I've put 2 slides that I meant to do in one go. Anyway, startups are very inherently risky. They're often not family friendly, as I said. And money is a primary driver. Actually, a startup is all about a business. A business is all about money. Making money is about people's livelihoods. And it's also, as soon as you start getting venture capital funding and all of those kinds of things, you're talking about 10 times, 20 times. You know, they put in £1 million, they want the company to be worth 100 million so they can get 20 million pounds out of the business. You're under pressure at that point to do something about money rather than about the service that you created or anything else. It eventually becomes about generating money, not about the business necessarily. And I said expectation to work long hours, contracts can be flexible. Certainly within the startup world, if you've got a contract, if you've got a salary, you know, you're paid. You know, you're paid actually until the money runs out. That's how a startup works. You don't have a long term. It's not a job security situation. If you want job security, go and work in a big organisation that's not going to run out of money. and probably don't work in startups. It doesn't work. Morality is an interesting one. A lot of people will do a lot of things just to make money. And being in a startup, I've been asked to do a lot of things to make money for other people, put advertising in certain places or trick people into doing things, and I have to be very careful about understanding that that's a bad thing to do. How many people have read the stuff around Uber and the sexism and everything else? Really, only... So does anyone not know the story about Uber? Hands up, please be honest. I'm really serious. So, okay, that's a big topic to go into. Go and I can't remember her name. Anyone remember her name? No. It was about 2-3 weeks ago, and it was a blog post by a lady who worked at Uber who left. Yes, thank you very much, Susan Fowler. And the story is horrific. Absolutely horrific. And it's what happens when a company is more bothered about the tech talent than it is on protecting people from predatory males, protecting females primarily, but not just females, protecting others, people who are different from people who are going to do them harm, and then protecting those people who are doing harm because they're good at tech. And that actually happens within the world. In various different, it's not just a sexism thing, but it's quite inherent, certainly within Silicon Valley, and it's quite inherent actually within startups in the UK as well, because we learn a lot from Silicon Valley. And I think it's quite a difficult thing to try and learn and understand. But it's not just sexism, it's also understanding family life, it's also understanding people who are different in various different ways. And tech is not very well known for being good at this area. So what we're going to do is, this is the last one, isn't it? No, it's one more. This is just a few kind of ideas and rules that I've kind of put in place. No startup is worth your whole life. Never is. Because you only get 1% of them are funded even to seed level. You can imagine that not even, a proportion of them don't even get anywhere near Series A and funded beyond that. It's not worth your whole life. Don't go into debt unless you know you're going to be able to get money out of it at some point. Try your very hardest to limit your exposure to all of these things. Spend time with your family. You only have one family and you don't have an unlimited supply of time. But most people don't realise this when they're young. When you do a startup, expect to work hard. Expect to think about how that's going to affect your life. Not only that you're going to spend time with people, but you're going to have different priorities. Honesty and integrity, I think, is quite important. I'm realising this. You're all kind of sitting there quietly. You're all going to have to answer some questions and talk to each other in a minute. So I'm just kind of preparing you for that. I think one of the things that the church certainly needs to learn about and understand is that risk is not the same thing as gambling. Although gambling is all about risk. But if you understand, okay, I've got a question. How many of you play poker? A few people, and actually there are a few people in the room who are not putting their hands up because they think it's the wrong thing to do. And it's not, it's a game. It's a game that you can play. You don't have to play for money, you can learn it. It's actually a pretty good way of learning and understanding risk. It's not a particularly good way of running a business, but it's certainly a good way of understanding how risk works. And when there's a good time to take a push forwards and when there isn't. And I think actually if we understood that a little bit more, I think we'd actually be better within the church. Money isn't everything. Family is far more important. But people still think about money as being certainly within the way that we approach the church, money is often seen as a salary. You think about money, actually how much do you make a month is actually how you think about it. And actually money is much broader than that, and actually you need to think about it in various different ways. How many people have failed in a startup? A few. Not enough, as far as I'm concerned. If you want to do a startup, or if you want to go anywhere near that kind of world, or you want to learn about that world, you've got to learn to fail. and you've actually got to learn to fail really well. And that's actually quite important, because actually what we do within the church is as soon as someone drops out or does something wrong, what we generally do is just push them to one side and never give them any responsibility ever again. Actually, the interesting thing is that VCs will probably only talk to you if you've had a failure. And you have to have had a failure of some sort. It doesn't necessarily mean you've had a startup failure. You can have a failure in various different walks of life. But they will look at you as much better at understanding risk because you've had a failure. So if you want to do a startup and fail at it. And don't take too much time over it. And fail in 6 months. And then go, right, I've learned something, and do another one. And just so you all know, salaries are not a guarantee of stability anymore. It used to be that everyone got a job and it was a job for life, and we don't have that anymore, and the world is different. We have a gig economy now. We have Uber, we have Deliveroo, we have all of these people who do various different things, and that's the world we're going to be moving towards, and there's not a lot we can do about it. But salaries are not a guarantee of stability any longer. So I've kind of given you a broad overview of techs and startups and lots of other bits and pieces. What we're going to do now is kind of actually stick with your tables. I don't want to go into 3s, I want to go into 6 or 7. I want you to talk amongst each other. Is that all right? Yep, fine. Talk about this with your group and talk about these questions. And think about it from the point of view of not only how should we approach startups, but how should Christians approach these problems. So really kind of see if you can think about it in those terms. Should we be more encouraging, and should we be encouraging more Christians into startups and more startups? Should we actually be putting money, putting time, putting energy into risky ventures? Next question is actually then, how should we approach risk? As a Christian, how should you approach risk? Is it inherently bad? Is it something we need to learn about? My opinion is that we should, but I want you to talk about it. And again, failure. Talk about failure, understand it. Is it bad? What's good, what's bad? And it would be an interesting conversation to talk about your experience within the church and within a congregation setting of people's approaches to work, people's approaches to ministry, people's approaches to money, and try and understand a little bit of that and see if in a more gig economy-based system or in a more inherently unstable, risky system like a startup, how you should, is that good or bad? How should we play that within the church? And how should Christianity affect your work and the way you manage people? It's not just your work. If you're a manager, as I am, and I've got a number of people under me, for example, I'll give you a quick example. I try to make sure they go home by 5:30 every evening. I work in a startup. That's pretty much unheard of. But I do that and I tell them, honestly, I want them to have a life. I want them to come in and tell me they've climbed a climbing wall faster than they've ever done it before. I don't want them to come in and tell me they've fixed a bug. But that's me, and that's an unusual person. Anyway, so that's kind of talk amongst yourselves, and then we'll kind of come back. Do you want to? You fine? That's fine. So I kind of hope that's kind of given you a little bit of a taste of the kind of where startups are coming from and the kind of things that affect them. And part of what I wanted to kind of get out of this evening was a bit more discussion about these kind of topics and try and understand it myself. I don't have all the answers. I work in tech. I'm probably the worst person to try and figure this one out. But I want more input as well. So we'll see where we get to, and then we'll come back and a few of us will kind of sit up here and we can figure out where we go from there. Okay?